I watched the interesting interview where you talked about even when you give girls trucks, they still name them and almost treat them like babies.
I was going to tell you about that story.
Oh, okay, great. Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Carly with Now This Her, and I'm joined by Dr. Marianne Legato. What an honor it is to have you here. This is our second episode of The Doctor Is In, where viewers can ask a physician or a specialist any question that they choose. And you certainly are that, a specialist. You have basically created this science of gender-specific medicine. So that's fascinating, obviously, for our women's page, but even for men, because you study both sexes
Yes.
very closely, and down to a science, what makes us so different. You've written some interesting books. Why Men Die First is one of the titles I found quite interesting, and then this one, Why Men Never Remember and Women Never Forget. This might be a relief to a lot of couples, right?
That's a manual on how to get along.
I look forward to reading this, but let's start with the beginning. What made you get into a science that didn't even exist?
That's a wonderful question. Like many of my colleagues at Columbia, I was involved in research. And at the time that I was doing my work, we only studied males. And why? For a few reasons. We thought women were too complicated with their cyclic hormone changes. Mm-hmm. We also felt they were vulnerable, and that to experiment with them or study them might endanger their reproductive biology. Mm-hmm. Now, mind you, we never asked about disturbing the reproductive biology of men, which is fascinating, and that's a cultural idea that I hope we've discarded. When in 1990, the American Heart Association said to me, you know, there's a journalist here who thinks that women are being discriminated against, that their experience of heart disease is different from that of men, and her mother had been very ill, and she asked for a cardiologist to help her. So we wrote this wonderful book called The Female Heart, which she spearheaded. It was her curiosity and her idea. Uh-huh. And as I did the research and talked to her, I thought, wow, the hearts of men and women are really different. Duh. Maybe other organs are different as well. And from that, we pursued the science of the human experience of disease as a function of whether they're male or female, and it turns out to be completely different in many ways.
Uh-huh. And women are actually, that's one of the killers for women, heart disease, right?
Yes. Men actually begin to show the symptoms at 35. They have a 10-year lead on us in terms of heart disease, and it's lethal for men just as it is for women. But women get a pass because of probably their genes, mm-hmm. their famous double X chromosome, but also their hormones. Estrogen is probably protective. But
really?
After menopause, the score evens out, and more women die of heart disease than men.
Huh. And the symptoms are different, right?
Yes.
I had heard you in a different interview talking about how, you know, it often goes undiagnosed with women. Yes. Because what, they think they just have the flu?
Right.
That's
well, first of all,
terrifying.
Denial for both men and women is profound. About 15% of women never get chest pain per se. Mm. They think they have indigestion, back pain. They become short of breath and anxious and begin to sweat. And they think they're having an anxiety attack. One patient of mine sent out for Chinese soup. She thought that would help, and met the EMT people at the door saying, I don't know if there's anything really wrong. Uh-huh. But in fact, women wait 4 hours longer than men in general to report to anybody to say that they think they're having a heart attack.
Fascinating. Okay, so this goes all the way back to conception. You say that for some scientific reason, boys, infants are actually weaker since conception.
Well, what's interesting to us is that about 2.5 times as many boy embryos are conceived and go through pregnancy, but they're so frail compared to girls, and we don't know exactly why, mm-hmm. that the ratio is almost 1-to-1 by the time they're born. And when they are born, girls definitely have the advantage. They hear first. They are more aware of their environment. They respond to facial expressions more than boys. Boys do not have a respiratory system that's developed enough to protect them, especially if they're premature. And it's such a situation that I was talking to a neonatologist who said, every time I hear there's a baby in trouble, I pray it's not a boy, because that's more fragile.
Really?
Well, you remember Patrick, the son of the Kennedys, who died?
Yes.
Right after he was born, he had respiratory insufficiency.
Really? Okay. So is that why then little girls tend to, they're taller, they mature a little bit faster, both physically and mentally than boys? Is this all starting from the womb?
Well, it's certainly fashioned in the womb. There is a male and a female brain for sure. And this is determined in the womb very early, by the second month of gestation. You are either, from a neurological point of view, male or female, and that's where the sense of whether you are male or female is developed. And people who have gender confusion or issues about whether they're male or female, it may be actually a developmental situation in which the development of the brain and the later development of the genitalia, for example, which are not happening at the same time, are somehow out of kilter. And so we're beginning to look as gender-specific experts, not just at the binary male or female, but the enormous transitional area in between, where people are transgender, they are homosexual. All of those are variations, I think, on the biology of sex.
You know, I feel that studying that, while it's so needed and timely, having evidence to actually support what so many find to be truth would only help even more so in the political arena, right? Especially as we elect a vice president who believes in conversion therapy. I'm sure there's a large population out there who needs...
Mr. Pence and I need to have a cup of coffee.
Yeah, maybe you can help him out a little bit. So if you're just joining us, this is Dr. Legato, and this is The Doctor Is In. You can ask this specialist on gender-specific medicine any question that you might have. Let's get into this book, because this is pretty fascinating. It's inevitable that biology affects our psychology, right?
Absolutely.
So if you've ever lived with the opposite sex, then you have a glimpse into just how different we are and how differently we handle conflict, challenge, etc.
Right.
But this is funny, especially I've lived with my boyfriend for 3 years, so it's, I know he's not going to remember, and I, supplement for that. I know he's not going to wake up when the alarm goes off, and so I put his phone on the other side of the apartment. And
what do you think are his best features for you?
His best features for me?
That are different from your own talents.
He's business savvy. He's great with money. He's very, he challenges me to always be better in my job. And so I've professionally become better thanks to him. And he's more he'll take risks that I won't. It was his idea to move to New York. I would have never done it alone.
They are great risk takers.
Yeah, and you know that scientifically?
Well, I think that from an evolutionary point of view, if you didn't leave the cave door, you weren't going to get very much to supply the family.
So why was the weaker person leaving the cave?
His job is to deposit his genes in as many uteri as possible. I mean, that's from an evolutionary point of view.
Right.
His job is to continue the gene pool and also to provide food and protection for the family. And even from the earliest times, women are fashioned to be very responsive to the young, to be protective of them. If you notice, one of the interesting things, I was reading my own book on the way here to refresh myself about what you might be interested in hearing. But do you ever notice a woman talking to a newborn baby? Her facial expressions are exaggerated. She talks in a very different tone because the frequency that they hear is much more high-pitched than the deep voices.
Really?
Yeah. Men do not do that in general. But that rough and tumble characteristic of males when they throw the baby into the air as your heart stops watching is important to the development of the child and the child's ability to trust and to take and to tolerate risk and challenges like that. The other interesting thing is in our response to stress, a stressful or unpleasant situation, and it characterizes the way we react to an argument, for example, estrogen is a very important player in an argument, and it sensitizes a wide area of the brain to experience the challenge, and we remember it in great detail, and we respond to stress, which is situated in a part of the brain called the amygdala, by raising our blood pressure, our heart rate, and we release a stress hormone called cortisol.
Right, belly fat. That's all I think
not
when
overnight,
I hear of that
not
one.
overnight.
Okay.
That cortisol level stays up in a woman for 24 hours.
Uh-huh.
So she can't sleep, she agitates, she thinks about it. For a man, there is no such mechanism. Mm-hmm. The threat goes right to the frontal part of his brain. He makes a decision about how to handle it, and it's over for him. Mm-hmm. And so they come to the breakfast table, and she says, about last night. And he said, what?
Yeah.
What happened last night? Not
Or
interested.
even worse, I mean,
Over.
throughout the night, she's pissed that
Right.
he's sleeping soundly and she can't
Absolutely.
freaking sleep.
Right.
Clearly, he doesn't love me because he can sleep right now.
Right. That's another interesting comment after intercourse. Mm-hmm. Women's and men's oxytocin rise
Right.
from bonding. Did you know this?
I know that that's the baby bonding hormone, right? That's why.
Also the lover bonding.
Uh-huh.
hormone. And women's oxytocin stays up. Testosterone, interestingly, antagonizes oxytocin. And so after sex, a man is very likely to reach for the remote control or go to sleep or decide he's hungry. Mm-hmm. And that oxytocin buzz, if you will, is over for men very quickly. Mm-hmm. Whereas women want to cuddle and talk and continue to be warm. And that shouldn't be taken personally if you're a woman.
Yeah.
And it can really disturb women. One woman said to me she felt as though her husband had thrown a cup of cold water in her face by falling asleep.
And the solution to, it sounds like the solution to most of our relationship issues are just understanding the differences biologically, right?
It's my theory.
So is it biological? Or are their brains actually different, or are hormones to blame? Because you had mentioned, estrogen. I actually watched a conference on the hormonal transitioning for transgender communities, and one doctor, a woman, just admitted estrogen just makes people crazy. Even men, give him enough estrogen.
Give a woman enough testosterone, she becomes crazy too.
Really? Okay, good. That makes
Sure,
me
too
feel
much
better.
of everything.
Right. But estrogen's very complex.
I think the brains are different from the moment of conception, and that's under the impact of genes and also of the hormones. If you're XX, or rather if you're XY, you start to make testosterone, which interestingly enough helps the brain become male, but is converted into estrogen before it enters the brain cells, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, fascinating.
So the brains are different. Men's brains are bigger by about 10%. We have more gray matter in certain areas of our brain, particularly those involved with speech. We use different chemicals to transmit messages from one nerve cell to another. Women have more connectivity between the left and the right brain. They certainly hear better. They understand and retain with much bigger vocabularies the spoken word. If you read a John Grisham novel, this was actually done, to a man and a woman, the woman will remember many more details if you read it out loud.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So men are rather simple. Let's get up and do it, achieve it. They're very focused. They're single-minded. Parallel processing is not their forte, maybe because we don't ask them to do it.
Right.
And it's a good compliment.
Okay, so did we answer why men never remember?
Yeah, I think so.
Why don't they remember?
Because it's not important. They take a decision, they deal with it, and it's over.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay.
And because women are so verbal and so interested in facial... Another interesting thing about men, they have trouble detecting expression unless it's fear or anger,
Yeah.
right? So you're kind of at a loss if you, if you challenge a man to say, look at me, I'm sad.
Right.
Don't bother. Tell him what you would like.
Uh-huh.
Very important.
Okay. Okay, so Delia has a question. She says...
Do these come in right from as we're talking?
Yeah. She says, what are some things you'd like to see more women doing throughout their lives to maintain their health?
Well, I think health comes from, obviously, the right nutrition, sleep, exercise, a good balance, and learn that early in life. But it also comes from a sense of self with which you're comfortable. And if you're not comfortable with who you are, I think you should be talking to somebody early on and not deal with chronic emotional dissatisfaction or pain. The second thing is to do something that you love. No matter what anyone says, everyone should have an internal dream. And many women in my generation, 700 years ago, were discouraged from pursuing their dream. And when I was in medical school, there were 13 of us for 143 men. I recommend that ratio. I had a wonderful time.
Oh my goodness, that's awesome.
But to be a surgeon was unthinkable.
Yeah.
And I remember orthopedics professors telling me that women simply didn't have the strength to be orthopedic surgeons and so on. You have to have an inner sense of confidence and always listen, seek advice, but follow your own concept of what would make you happy.
Interesting.
That's really important for health.
Yeah. So being only one of 13, you said? Geez, especially with sexism being such a relevant topic right now, I think a lot of women in America, especially the millennial generation, had kind of thought, you know, pay gap was really the biggest of our concerns. But now we see that...
I thought, not to be too political, I thought Mrs. Clinton was beaten to death with misogyny.
I mean, we saw her criticized for everything, from her shoes to her voice to her health to everything. Yeah. So it's alive and well, right?
I'm afraid more so than I had even understood.
And what is that about?
I think people power is not distributed like vitamins equally across the human population. Power belongs to those who can take it and subsequently hold it.
Yeah.
And men have had power, and they are not interested in sharing it, especially with usurpers, their wives, their daughters, whom they think they're protecting, and that's valid, but in whom, in many cases, a discouraged, independent, peer relationship with the women in their lives. My father, for example, who was a wonderful teacher for me, when I really went to medical school, he insisted on choosing the school and then decided he really didn't want me to be a doctor unless I promised never to marry, and I stayed at home practicing medicine with him.
Because he was a doctor.
Because he was a doctor.
Interesting.
And so that ambivalence about protection, protective feelings about women, and a wish to maintain control, I think, is at the basis of a lot of issues.
And
what do you think?
Well, I think that being a woman who has tried to, dance on that line of being a boss and not coming across as a bitch, that's very common. It's hard for women to be authoritative and not be...
You have to retreat from that notion.
Right, well...
Clear communication and not being defensive if somebody looks upset. It's our role in life from the time human beings came on Earth is to nourish and support. Right? But there is a way of negotiating, which I learned from men.
Yeah.
Which is make your point clearly, make sure the person understands it, and listen to what they have to say. But don't feel personally offended. If they're upset, don't feel that you have to rescue them.
Right.
But set out clearly what it is you expect of them.
But are we not as strong in business because of we are more emotional? Is that, that a lot of men would argue that women are too emotional.
Well, a lot of men would argue a lot
right,
to keep
of
women
course.
out of business and positions of power. And I think the notion of being afraid of being a bitch should be really exercised. To be clear, to ask for standards that you want for your business or your personal life is not being bitchy. You can be nasty and offensive. That is not pleasant.
Right.
And you won't get very far that way. But I think the concept of I don't want to be a bitch by being assertive or strong, get rid of that. Delia asked about her health.
Yeah.
One of the things I'd like to say is that pediatricians are geniuses at taking care of children. and they know the difference between boys and girls. Ask any pediatrician. They've done gender-specific medicine long before us. They know the differences in developmental pace, abilities, susceptibility to illness. Once you're 18, girls go to the gynecologist, and the gynecologist takes care of them until the first serious general illness occurs. And I would urge all women and men to get a general practitioner, internist, generalist, right as they walk out of the pediatrician's office. Because life is not simply a bikini view of women, where breast cancer and reproductive function are the only concerns. There are other elements in your health. And I think I would tell Delia and her colleagues to find a physician who will take care of all of you and see you as a complete integrated whole, not just an issue in will you get breast cancer, which many women still think is their chief issue,
Right.
and will your reproductive ability work and flourish. So,
Okay, and do we have any questions? Yeah?
We have a bunch. Margaret Fuller says, how can we encourage cross-gender empathy? It can be difficult to understand the other sex's feelings to the point where I know men and women who truly don't believe the other gender has legitimate feelings. Is there an effective way to combat that misunderstanding?
is the young lady's question that she doesn't believe that men and women think their feelings are legitimate? They don't respect them?
She knows men and women who don't believe the other gender has legitimate feelings, so she wants to know the most effective way to combat that misunderstanding.
Well, I wrote this book just to answer that question, and I would urge her to read it, because men are as delicate as we are in their way. They can be easily hurt, their confidence eroded, they can feel terribly lonely in a marriage or a relationship in which they're constantly being reproached for not producing what the woman thinks she needs, and vice versa. I think men have to make an effort to really sit down and understand that women have a totally different approach. They're protective, supportive, they're very verbal, they use hand gestures, they have facial expressions that are complicated. That's not the way a man responds to life. Most of them respond with, what do you want me to do about it? Tell me. And they shut down. But that doesn't mean that they don't have feelings.
And at the top of this
book... Does
book...
that answer the question?
I think so. The top of this book, it says, finally we have a Rosetta Stone to break the code and help decipher the opposite sex. I mean, that works in both ways, right?
Yeah,
this helps
of course.
men to understand women better,
Yes.
right?
And also, my book about men emphasizes that some of the reasons they die first is not just their physiology, but we ask them to do the most dangerous jobs in society. And I go through all the occupations that men have traditionally been asked to do.
Right. But biologically, and this is interesting, my very first women's studies class, my professor asked that we raise our hands if we were feminists, and I didn't, because she asked why. I said, I have 3 older brothers. I've learned that they can do things that I can't, just like I can do things that they can't. But I had just moved into my first apartment on my own, and I couldn't even get the mattress out of the truck. You know, I had to ask someone.
You found the apartment and moved in.
Right. And, you know, when you're financially stable, you can pay someone to do that for you. But I ended up finding like a male neighbor to just pick it up on his own.
Resourceful.
Right. But they are built differently, right? The way that they deposit their fat is different, and their upper body.
Their whole exercise physiology is different. That's a whole gender-specific exercise physiology is a whole special field.
So is that why they do these more labor-intensive jobs?
Yes, I think we select them out for their brawn as well as their brain.
Yeah.
And traditionally, women have never gone to war until very recently.
Yeah.
And women have not really, in a sense, hope this doesn't irritate your audience, taken on their fair share of responsibility for the stability of society. And it is refreshing to know that they are empowered now to go to war and do military service,
Right.
in spite of the perils of that for them. And I think it's important for whatever government we have to try to make sure that their path is not encumbered by assaults and sexual torment,
Right.
so that they can continue to bravely, I think, as men have been, bravely willing to share their responsibility for the stability of society. For example, volunteering for clinical trials in medicine. They have been exempted from that. We did all our research in men, and women complained about that, but they didn't volunteer, and it's hard sometimes to get women who are premenopausal to volunteer for studies. And I have heard this so many times. My reproductive life is over, so of course I'll volunteer. Well, we need to know about women your age and the age of your audience, and they have to be brave enough to take the risk that men have traditionally taken to be part of clinical studies, so that we can better understand their biology. So that's a very important message.
Interesting. Anything else you see?
Yeah, Sally wants to know, first of all, she's a big fan of your jacket, of your sweater.
Everyone's loving the style.
Yeah. She says, secondly, as a woman, what sort of daily supplements, if any, should she take?
How old is she?
31.
She should.
I'm a friend.
Okay. When a 31-year-old walks into my office, the first and most important thing is, tell me about your day. How much sleep do you get? What do you eat? Make sure that there's a reasonable balance of food. And what exercise do you do? I then look at their vitamin D levels, which are often lower than optimal. I encourage them to use calcium as a supplement. If their hair and nails are not doing well, biotin is a good thing. So I don't tell everybody to just go and get Centrum
The multivitamin.
in the drugstore, but to be intelligent about their needs. Many young women have an iron deficiency, especially vegetarians. Eating disorders are very common in women who are trying to, and men, by the way.
Yeah.
So all of those factors enter into what I would tell your 31-year-old, were she my patient, which is, tell me about yourself, how well are you doing, what are your specific needs, and that's how we do
And that's probably across the board to any young professional, right? A woman in her mid to late 20s all the way through her 30s, right? Calcium is something that women, at what age do we start losing calcium?
It depends on your personal habits, but it usually starts in the early 20s. Not calcium, but bone mass if you're not careful. So you have to do bone densities on people who have specific challenges to bone density, like eating disorders, for example, or starvation diets, and poor nutrition.
Yeah. Okay. And
You know what a bone density is?
I mean, I've heard it my entire life. I would like to think I know, but doesn't that mean if you don't have bone density, you're
subject to fractures more
right.
easily? Yeah. It really is a sense of how thick, if you will, your bones are at any given age.
Yeah, I mean, my stepdad used to always tell me I was big boned as a kid, but I'm not so sure now
Was that
I'm
good
an
or
adult.
bad for you?
Well, he was using that to like explain to me why I wasn't like frail looking like some of my friends, and I wanted so badly to be a little like skin and bone girl. You know, we want what we can't have, right? They wanted to look like muscular like I had because I was in sports. I digress. But
that's okay. It makes a point.
knowing what you know now about health and relationships and about both sexes,
Right.
what would you go back and tell your 25-year-old self?
I love that question. I was a hothead. And to this day, my daughter is just turned off by my ability to react quickly to any challenge. I think what I would say is a few things. One, decide what you personally would like to achieve and set yourself a goal. Two, ask for advice, not just from your mother and father, who usually have reasons of their own for guiding you in a certain way, but go and ask what college you might want to go to. And don't wait for your parents to take you. Go and find out. The most successful women I know have found their own path. My best friend was one of the first women in the class at Harvard Business School.
Wow.
And when she went to Harvard, she just decided that when she went out into the world, she decided that that's what she would aim for. Her college selection was fascinating to me. And she chose a college to which she was culturally better suited, Randolph-Macon, than Wellesley. I think she she also considered. But the point was she did it on her own. So for any 25-year-old, decide what your goal is at that time. Second, get plenty of advice on your own. And 3, say yes to every opportunity that comes your way. You never know what you will get by coming down here, for example. I never know whether I will have a positive or negative response from your audience, but it's worth a try, as my 3-year-old would say. It's worth a try, Mom. So say yes to every opportunity.
And is there a reoccurring mistake that you see, the 20-somethings? You see both male and female patients, so I would think that mistake is different because we're so different. But
I think it's always the same mistake. They give up.
Really?
In the face of a challenge, if it doesn't go their way or they can't figure out how to meet it or it's painful, the ability to endure a little pain is important. And you should understand that life is not a smooth upward curve, but it's a jagged curve. And that periods of discouragement and sadness, if they're not too terrible, you can get through with a little perseverance and a little emotional stamina.
Are you talking about the election right now? Because we can all relate here, especially at the office, to, we're out on the streets here in New York. You see people are sad, and some people...
Me too, Coach.
Yeah.
We're all sad. And I think that... I think this election is a tragedy.
Yeah.
And I hope that Americans will, instead of just protesting in the streets, which I think, by the way, is important as a sign, I hope they will each, in his own way, decide that this is potentially a tragically dangerous situation and do the best that they can to find organizations and make connections which can at least hold the fort until the country perhaps makes a better decision. That's my feeling. I think my most intelligent friends, including, for example, my son, who's a lawyer, who said he immediately connected with his compatriots and decided that they would defend pro bono any immigrant or victim of a hate crime that they found, and that would be their particular contribution.
Fascinating. Yeah.
I just want to end on one final comment. Nick Redwell says, 2 brilliant and beautiful women. I hope my daughters grow up to be so graceful and intelligent if we ever have kids.
Oh, what a sweet
very
thing
nice.
to say.
And a lot of people are asking where they can find your books.
They're on Amazon.
Okay.
Just, type in my name, and I've written a few, but
You have a ton.
This is my favorite.
This one is. Okay, so Why Men Never Remember and Women Never Forget, Dr. Legato, thank you so much for joining us.
What a pleasure.
I could talk to you all day, I feel. Thank you so much, and thanks for tuning in.